In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. We're looking today in our Old Testament text, 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 1 through 15, and I've entitled this Simple Obedience. Sometimes obedience isn't complicated. Sometimes obedience isn't complicated. In my last house in Roanoke, Virginia, we were blessed to be on about an acre of land. And my whole thought when we were looking at houses, when I had taken a call to my former parish, and we were there for about 10 years, my kids have now returned there and are working in that general area. So Virginia was kind of where they grew up. But when I was going, I remember the discussions my wife and I had as we were looking at houses. I go, if I'm going to move to Virginia, I want to feel like I'm living in Virginia, right? We were around the Appalachian Mountains to the north of us and right in the middle of the Blue Ridge Mountains, and then the Roanoke Valley connected to both of those mountain ranges. And so we looked, and of course we were limited in what we could afford, but we found a place, and the only downside is that we had never lived where we had to rely on a well, and more importantly, a septic tank. And when you live in Bloomington, or Bloomington Normal, or as I did and my wife in major cities, right, with suburbs, you take for granted that when you flush the toilet, it's going to work, and when you turn on the water, it's going to come out. But when you lose electricity, in our area, that keeps going on. When you are on a septic and a well and you lose electricity, you've got nothing. And what would happen, as we learned early on, is storms would come through. And there's one time we were 2 days, or was it 3 days? Yeah, she doesn't remember. 2 days without power. And so not only did we not have electricity, we couldn't shower. We had to go down to a small business down below that we knew, and they let us bring up buckets of water. And that happened a couple times. After that, I said, I think we need other options. So I bought a generator. And I know nothing about generators. And so I'm learning, right? And so we had a hookup from the previous owner, and we paid some money, got it set up, so when we lost power, we at least would have basic necessities. We could get water, we could flush the toilet, we had some lights on, and it was wonderful. But the problem with a generator like that is if you let it sit too long, it gets kind of gummed up. And there are many people in this congregation, even sitting in this place today, who would have no problem getting that taken care of and moving right on their way. And then there's me. And so I'm researching things on why isn't this thing starting, because I'd left some gas in, and then somehow the carburetor, this and that, and so I ended up paying money to get it fixed at one time, to get the carburetor cleaned out, and that was a huge hassle. And so when we moved here, I brought the generator with me, and again ran into a similar problem when I wanted to use it. Tried this, read this, a lot of time. And then I talked to Roy Laws. And there are a lot of people with blessing, but there's something about Roy that you see this complex thing that you're trying to find. He goes, let me take a look at it. And 10 minutes later, it's fixed. And you're like, what just happened? He came over and he brought some starting fluid and he sprayed it in my carburetor, and I yanked it and it started. Less than 5 minutes, and I turned to him and said, "You are never allowed to die." I'm going to have to ask his permission to use that in the second service, but I think he'll be okay. What's my point? By going to someone who knows things you don't in a certain area, or is an expert in their field, you save yourself a lot of time and effort and frustration. Today, we are going to talk about a story, and it connects to our gospel reading because Jesus gets himself in trouble when he starts talking about the faith of foreigners in the Old Testament. And this is one of those stories where this man who knows nothing of the God of Israel, and in our vernacular, nothing of Christianity or faith in our God, comes from a pagan situation and is treated differently than he's used to being treated, and yet responds with some level of faith. Today we also see an impressive person who is asked to humble himself and simply obey to find healing and hope. But if he had chosen his own path, he would have never known the healing that God was offering him. Firstly, God knows what he's doing. But if we don't go to him for help, should we expect him to engage us as he would like? Secondly, when God asks us to obey, he often doesn't give us a detailed, thorough reason why. But he wants us to obey. When we obey, however, what we are told and what we find is that we grow in accepting life, healing, and hope. You see, sometimes obedience isn't complicated. In our passage today, looking at our first point, a person of accomplishment and yet weakness. Naaman, the commander of the army of the king of Aram, the Syrians, was a great man in high favor with his master, the king, because by him the Lord had given victory to Aram, the Syrian people. The man, though, was a mighty warrior and suffered from leprosy. This is a great man. This is in a time period of the kings. And there is a timeline where Elisha is the prophet, where 4 different kings show up, and we're not sure exactly what king. It's probably the master of Naaman has probably been Hadad the first. And this man had been a successful general, and so he had great favor with the king. But there's a problem. This man Naaman is wealthy, he's powerful, he's successful, he's famous, but he has a disease called leprosy. And the leprosy we know today is not the same leprosy they're likely talking about here, but it is enough that it's life-threatening, I believe, in this story, and is concerning. And it's like being one of the most successful people in the world, but having a debilitating disease. And without your health, the world just looks bleaker, doesn't it? Verse 2, now the Arameans, the Syrians, on one of their raids, had taken a young girl captive from the land of Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, if only my Lord were with the prophet, who was in Samaria, he would cure him of leprosy. So Naaman goes to the king and told what the girl had said from Israel. And the king of Aram said, go then, and I will send along a letter to the king of Israel. One of the things I want you to look for here is that with the greatness of this man, there are people who are nobodies behind the scene that God uses to heal him. And that first nobody is a slave girl. And if this tells you anything about where Israel was in its power base, this young girl was taken in a raid by the Syrians, who were likely the most powerful force in this region. Now let's not brush by that. This is a young girl who is taken from her family and brought to be a slave. Sometimes slaves were treated well, sometimes they weren't. But she had some kind of respect and love for this man that she would share, oh, I know how you can get help. And without that word, this story doesn't continue. Later, there's a kindness as a slave as well, and really a courage when Naaman doesn't like what he's hearing, and we're going to look at that in a second. But this slave, this servant of his that came and brought him there, redirected him to, well, are you sure you want to ignore this? Is this really that big of a deal? Again, a slave. a nobody. Not somebody who's powerful and well-known, and as we're going to see very, very wealthy. You see, sometimes obedience isn't complicated. What's his response? Well, it's a pagan response for a magical cure. They're in paganism. The whole idea of paganism generally, although overstated, generally true, is that we believe there are gods, and we believe there are gods all over here for different parts of nature and creation and fertility and the harvest and et cetera and et cetera. But the issue is if we got to placate the gods, then good things will happen for us. And we know in the Old Testament that sometimes the pagan powers were given some kind of influence and almost magic, likely from demonic forces, but were able to impress and sometimes even do some things that would help people or be seen as miraculous. So their whole context with this guy Elisha the prophet is, oh, we better bring a lot of good money to pay him off because we want to make sure he can get the God of Israel to do what we want. So the response of the king is like, hey, let me send a letter to Israel. You know, they know we're the tough guy in the area, and I'll have them take care of it for you. Easy peasy. So the king gets it and goes, what? What's happening? Can I give life and death? And he went, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of garments. And he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which reads, when this letter reaches you, know that I have sent you my servant Naaman, that you can cure him of his leprosy. End letter. Now, the money that he brings is probably in the tens of thousands. Somewhere, if I had to guesstimate, $10,000 to $30,000. All this and all these wealthy clothes and everything. I mean, Naaman is coming prepared. And the king reads this wrong. He's not trying to pick a fight with him. He's just thinking like pagans think. People who are in a polytheistic mindset. Then we see a prophet who shows up, a prophet of faithfulness and humility in verse 8. The king's beside himself. It may be King Joram here, we're not sure. Verse 8, but when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent a message to the king. When they were in distress in the ancient world, they would tear their clothes, but it's pretty big distress to do that. And it's showing a humility and a great fear. And it's showing a humility often before God that someone would help them or protect them. And so Elisha gets word of this. The king is troubled. And what is Elisha's response? It's simple. But when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent a message to the king. Why have you torn your clothes? Let him come to me, that he may learn that there is a prophet in Israel. That's it. Elisha, as we're going to see, isn't impressed by one of the most impressive persons in that world. Elisha, we're going to also see, is not ministering to this general Naaman for his approval or his money. And also, again, how did Naaman ever hear of Elisha the prophet? It may sound proud when Elisha says that he may know there's a prophet in Israel. But it isn't about Elisha. It's about the God he serves, as we will shortly see. Verse 11. Let's say verse 9. So Naaman came to Elisha's property with his horses and chariots and halted at the entrance of Elisha's house. Maybe it'd be similar to all the black limos that show up when the president goes anywhere. Pretty impressive, pretty wealthy, armored cars. Wow, it's the president. And he waits at the entrance, probably to his courtyard. And Elisha sent a messenger saying, go wash yourself in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean. The end of message. Now, this is not what Naaman is used to. This is not what the ancient world is used to. Do you not know who I am? I have come before your door. I have reverenced you. I haven't just barged in. And you don't even come out to meet me. You just give me this instruction to go wash in your less than impressive river. What's Naaman's response? Sometimes being impressive or being taken with those who seem impressive is just a thick smoke screen that blinds us from those things that are really what make life worth living. In other words, we have to ask ourselves a question as Christians: why are we impressed with people? Why is Elijah not impressed with this man? Why does God, when this man is so powerful, use people that are slaves with no standing? A slave had no vote. They had no input unless the master gave it to them. They had no power. They had no future or American dream or someday owning property. They had nothing, and yet these people are key to this man being healed. What are we impressed with, and what is God impressed with? But Naaman became angry and went away saying, I thought that for me he would surely come out and stand and call in the name of the Lord his God, and would wave his hand over the spot and cure the leprosy. Our final point: a miraculous healing due to simple obedience. Are not Abna and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? I don't know if it was at the flood stage, but when the River Jordan was at flood stage, it was muddy. It was hard to stand in. And it wasn't one of the most impressive rivers of the ancient world. This is what this guy's used to. Could I not wash in them and be clean? And he turned away and went in a rage. Now, don't pass by that. How dare you? Do you not know who I am? Now, before we get too hard on Naaman, what kind of expectations do we have because of who we see ourselves as? What we're owed, what we should get, how we should be treated. And we get angry, and sometimes if we stop and go, what are we really angry about? And again, it is not fun to be mistreated. I understand that. It is not fun when you've been waiting for your food for 30 minutes longer than you expected. But if we look at his context, it doesn't make it right, but it at least makes it understandable. And then a simple servant says to him, Father, if the prophet had commanded you to do something difficult, would you have not done it? How much more when all he said to you was wash and be clean? Now, I want to give Naaman a little credit here. We don't know a ton about him. But he could have backhanded that servant and said, don't you talk to me that way? But he listened. I think there's some signs that Naaman was more than just who he put on. That he would listen to a slave girl. That he would listen to a slave in his household at all, or give them any kind of respect. He doesn't respond in the text anyway, and he turned and went away. He's in verse 14. So he went down, and some commentators are saying maybe that's also a sign of humility. But he went down and immersed himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God. And his flesh was restored like the flesh of a young boy, and he was clean. A miraculous healing due to simple obedience. Then he returned to the man of God and all the company. He came and stood before him and said, "Now I know, Elisha, that you're impressive and that you're the real deal." No, that's not what he said. "Now I know that there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. Please accept a present from your servant." And Elijah said, he said, "As the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will accept nothing." Elijah wasn't doing this for his own prestige, so he could hobnob with important people and go around and drop names on everybody with, everybody I know. And it's fun to meet, known people. It's fun to, I'm not knocking that. I've been able to meet some famous people and famous athletes by accident. But do I think they're better than the rest of the world? Do I think that somehow they're valuable and I need their approval? Now I've gone down a wrong road. And we also go down those things. But you know what God is impressed with? Those that are obedient. He's given a simple obedience. And one commentator says, actually, this is miraculous, that a man of this stature and power and influence would obey at all in humility. And he comes back and says, "Now I know there is a God in Israel." And we don't have time to look at it, but the text later says, Elijah goes, "I didn't do this for money. I don't follow God so I can get wealthy. I'm not doing this for my power and my prestige." But I think it's very, very interesting how clear it was to Naaman to give the glory and honor to the gods. Why? Because that's the way they thought in that world. And Elijah didn't get in the way. He was humble. Choosing to obey the commands of the Lord reveals that we trust in him and not some other pagan or magical option that promises better. And while we don't deal with paganism, we deal with this idea of people that are Christians, but kind of pick and choose where they're going to obey God or not, and then wonder why they don't have spiritual strength in life. Or with people in the culture who say, "I'm an atheist, I'm an agnostic." And when they say that, what they're saying is, "I will be my own God," and we're really terrible at it. But when we come to Christ and we obey him, even though we don't always understand what he's doing, it's an act of faith that says, "You're worth following." But you're not going to get a ticker tape parade most of the time. God's not going to come down and, "Are you confused? I'm sorry." That's not how he works. But even with Naaman, he was involved in his life. If you look at that first verse, what does it say? And he was successful in his things because the Lord had put him in that position. The Lord was behind it. The Lord was not okay with his evil, but the Lord was not detached from what was going on in the world. We have to trust him. What did Jesus say to his disciples? "If you love me, you will obey my commands." Now, love's much more and engages our emotions too, but it looks like something. It's an action. If you say you love me, but you disobey me, your love's not very strong. And then later, near where he was going to death, he looked at his disciples and said, "You are no longer just my servants, you are my friends." And why? What does he say in John? "Because you obey my commandments." We're in a realm of Christianity that thinks we can have our Christianity and disobey God's clear teaching. We're confused. And it does not support and build a thriving, lasting church. It just encourages our own need for what? For money and wealth and impressiveness. And I can get a little God and carry on with the rest of my life. We're misunderstanding the God of Holy Scripture and the God who saves. Are there areas where it is clear that God is asking for your obedience, but you're making things more complicated than is needed? Are you hesitating for your own prestige, your own wealth, your own pride? Spiritual growth, freedom from sin, and healing await, but we have to choose to obey his clear commands. Even if the water where he asks us to bathe is common and unimpressive. Thanks be to God.